Hey guys, this video is for the seniors. Today on this video, we're going to continue our discussion from class, where we're going over all the articles of the Constitution. We left off at Article 7 of the Constitution, which was the ratification process. Now, the thing is that the Constitution was actually it was pretty controversial, which surprises some people maybe because the Constitution is almost has this mythic image today, right? That the Constitution is like kind of like almost like American scripture. But remember, a lot of the people who wrote the Constitution themselves disagreed on the interpretation of the Constitution. And also, there were a lot of people in the 1700s who just opposed the Constitution. Remember, 13 delegates actually left the convention, largely, well, maybe some because of the heat, but largely because they just didn't agree with what the finished product was going to be. Three delegates refused to sign it. So I think that sometimes is just a little bit lost when, in our discussions of the Constitution, like, people think it came down from Mount Olympus and like all these wise sages were all on board with the whole idea of the Constitution. And that's just not true. There were just a lot of people who just disagreed with the Constitution itself, but also, disagreed with, their the end result. Which established a strong central government, and people disagreeing who wanted the Constitution. A lot of them disagree in the interpretation of the Constitution. Alexander Hamilton and James Madison were probably more instrumental in writing the Constitution than any two other people. Within a few years of the Constitution being finished, they disagreed profoundly on the interpretation of it. So that's the problem, I think, when people, are all about originalism and like all of that, when they want to interpret the Constitution to be exactly the way the founders intended it. That's a whole school of thought, particularly on the more conservative end of things. But that's, I would argue, almost impossible because the people who wrote it disagreed about the original intent. So how could we decipher what the original intent is 230 plus years later? So the ratification process turned out to be very controversial, particularly in rural areas of the 13 states, and conservative parts of the country. There were a lot of people who, this echoes a lot of arguments today from more conservative people. They were very concerned about the fact that the federal government was so big in the new Constitution. They felt it was going to be too far removed from the people. They felt it was taking power away from the states. A lot of big states' rights, excuse me, a lot of big states' rights a lot of states' rights supporters in the countryside, particularly in the United States. But probably the biggest reason that people objected to the Constitution, the newly written Constitution, was the fact that the Constitution did not have a Bill of Rights. That it didn't exactly spell out what rights you have as an American from the government being too oppressive. That was the whole idea. People who wanted a Bill of Rights, they basically said the individual needs protections from the government. Now, that was the major sticking point in terms of like whether the Constitution was going to be ratified. Now, in 1787, the Constitution was finished in September 17th, 1787. By the end of the year, 3 states had already ratified the Constitution. The first state to ratify the Constitution is the state of Delaware. They're very proud of that. It's actually on their license plates. First state, the president's home state. So 3 states ratified it by the end of 1787. In January 1788, 2 more states ratified the Constitution. So that leaves 5. Article 7 said 9 states have to approve the Constitution in order for it to take effect in the entire country. They didn't ask for unanimity like the old Articles of Confederation did, because that's just a recipe for gridlock. But they said that we need 9 states. Now, support for ratifying the Constitution was very weak in big parts of the country, including some really big states, important states, New York and Virginia and Massachusetts. There were a lot of people who did not support the ratification of the Constitution. So James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay wrote the Federalist Papers to try to convince the public about why the Constitution is important. The Federalist Paper, why it had to be ratified. The Federalist Papers are generally considered to be the most important documents in all of American political history, right? Because they basically laid out, if you guys take political science in college, which probably most of you will at some point, you are going to read the Federalist Papers. I'm going to post in Google Classroom Federalist Paper number 10, which is probably the most significant, even though 51 is also significant, but there's a whole debate about that. But the Federalist Papers were written to justify the need for this Constitution. And in doing so, Madison and Hamilton, Jay only wrote 5 of them. Hamilton and Madison wrote most of them. And in trying to make the case to the American public about the need for the Constitution, what they were actually doing was actually laying the groundwork for American political theory and the American system of government. Basically, laying out the reasons why why the government was designed the way it was in the Constitution. Now, the group that opposed the ratification of the Constitution were a group called the Anti-Federalists. Now, the Anti-Federalists were opposed to the new Constitution for a variety of reasons. The people who supported the Constitution were called the Federalists, not to be confused with the Federalist Party that emerged during the Washington administration. So the Federalists wanted to ratify the Constitution. The Anti-Federalists were opposed to the Constitution being ratified. And the reasons why they opposed the Constitution being ratified were varied. The largest reason, or the biggest reason why a lot of people just did not think the Constitution should be ratified, was because they said the federal government that it creates is just way too powerful. The federal government's going to be too far removed from the people. It's not going to really represent them adequately. And the power of the federal government is going to come at the expense of state governments, which a lot of Anti-Federalists believed were closer to the people. Many Anti-Federalists, as we said in class, opposed the idea of a presidency because they felt that could get too monarchical. Some people said, well, why was the Constitution written in all this secrecy? That, aroused suspicion. They actually, at the Constitutional Convention, actually kept the windows nailed shut. So, nobody could actually hear what was going on. So it just contributed to the overall, the oppressive heat of the Constitutional Convention with the with the windows shut in the middle of a Philadelphia summer. But the larger reason that they opposed the Constitution, the Anti-Federalists, was philosophical. They just did not believe that the federal government, that a national government, should be so strong. And they felt that the Constitution that was created at the convention was establishing a government that was too strong. So that line of thinking has been prominent throughout American history, right? You could actually argue that a lot of American history is this philosophical struggle between those who believe in a powerful federal government and those who believe in a limited federal government and support states' rights, right? That debate extends to the present day, right? That's a big area. That's the biggest area before Trump came along, the biggest area of dispute between liberals and conservatives, right? What should be the proper role of the federal government? So that's not something that just appeared now, right? That's been a debate for as long as we've been a country, right? When the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists were debating whether the Constitution should be ratified, that was the biggest issue. Rural people, conservative-minded people generally did not support the ratification of the Constitution because it made the government too big. Now, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists both published their views in newspapers about why the Constitution should be ratified or why it should not be ratified. And the ultimate votes on ratifying the Constitution, they held state conventions, to actually decide whether that state would ratify the Constitution, were very close. Massachusetts voted to ratify the Constitution 187 to 168. Virginia, which is why I did my thesis on in college, the ratification of the Constitution of Virginia, the vote was 89 to 79. My professor said I didn't mention Madison enough, which was a fair point. New York voted 30 to 27. So these votes are really close. So that shows that there was a lot of anti-federalist feeling in different parts of the country. All states, all 13, ultimately decide to ratify the Constitution, even though the last one didn't ratify the Constitution. I think it was Rhode Island, didn't ratify the Constitution until 1790. So the process took years to actually go along with this new document, because there was so much opposition to it. Now, anti-federalists, though, did score a major victory when they actually convinced James Madison, especially to Virginia, because the opposition in Virginia was intense. And if Virginia didn't ratify the Constitution, that's where Madison, who wrote the Constitution, most of it, came from. George Washington was from Virginia. How humiliating would that be if Virginia didn't ratify the Constitution? So in order to win support, James Madison said, okay, when you ratify the Constitution, I'm going to write a Bill of Rights, which would be amendments to the Constitution. Now, Madison was hesitant at first to actually include a Bill of Rights in the Constitution, because he said, well, if we just list all the rights that people have in the Constitution, it could be interpreted that, well, unless those rights are mentioned, then you don't have those rights. So that was his concern. But this is politics, right? And in order to win the support of people who oppose the Constitution, Madison agreed to draft a Bill of Rights. And the Bill of Rights became the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. And these rights, these first 10 amendments, are our basic protections as Americans. They are so important. So the Anti-Federalists are usually considered, with some justification, as being kind of backward looking and reactionary, right? The country could not continue going on with the Articles of Confederation. We needed the Constitution. So often the Anti-Federalists are portrayed as, trying to be barriers to progress, trying to block the Constitution, which you could largely agree with, but at the same time, they made a very important contribution, because if it wasn't for their opposition to the Constitution, I don't think a Bill of Rights would have ever been included. That was a response to their objections. So it was very important that we have a Bill of Rights in the Constitution. Now, I'm going to actually post on Google Classroom, all the the Bill of Rights, so you guys can actually read the wording yourself. But I'll just summarize the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. The First Amendment, and we're going to actually spend a lot of time going over each amendment in detail, like in our subsequent weeks and months. The First Amendment, arguably the most important amendment: freedom of religion, freedom of press, freedom of assembly, freedom to protest, freedom of speech, right? These are very, very important rights. The most important rights, the civil liberties that we have as Americans. You have the right to practice whatever religion you want. You have the right to speak against the government. You have the right to protest against the government, and you have the right to, publish articles against the policies of the government. So that our First Amendment protections are very important. Most other countries, even fellow Western democracies, don't have anything approaching the protections of the First Amendment. That's why it's easier to limit speech, hateful speech or whatever, in other countries, because they don't have a First Amendment. The Second Amendment, right to bear arms, right? Enormously controversial, because what does that mean? A well-regulated militia is the reason why why it says you have the right to bear arms. So that's a point of contention to this day, right? The third Amendment says you can never be forced to quarter troops in your house. That was a response to what the British used to do. The British used to just come to your house and say, listen, you have to, allow troops to stay in your house, and you have to feed them, you have to give them a bed, even if it's yours, you got to let them stay. That really, really angered the colonists who are now Americans. So they wanted to make sure that could never happen again. So that's why that amendment there. Maybe it seems a little random, but that was actually a response to what the British had been doing. The Fourth Amendment, there could be no unreasonable searches and seizures of your personal property without a warrant. So the police cannot just come into your house and start looking around, right? If they suspect that something's in your house or they want to do a search, they have to go to a judge who has to agree to sign a warrant in order to approve the search. The Fifth Amendment, no double jeopardy. You can't be accused of the same crime twice. If you were charged with a crime and you were acquitted, they cannot charge you again for the same crime. No double jeopardy. You have the right not to incriminate yourself. This is what we talked about in class a little bit today, right? You can never be made to be a witness against yourself. So that's why you have the right to, if asked questions, not to answer them, right? Because potentially you could be incriminating yourself. And the Fifth Amendment protects you from that. So you can never be made to be a witness against yourself. We had that whole discussion in the last class. I don't know if we did it in the first class, but the 8th period class, we had a whole discussion about that. It always is better to keep your mouth shut, right? Because to use your rights. And we talked about in class the risks of that, but the risks of not using your Fifth Amendment rights are greater. They're much greater. I just want to clarify that. You know, because we had a whole discussion eighth period about that. Also, the Fifth Amendment says that if you're accused of a crime, due process has to be followed. You have to know what you're being charged with. You have to be indicted by a grand jury. You have to have a trial, tried by a jury of your peers, and if found guilty, a judge has to sentence you. So that's due process. So the whole thing has to be followed if you're being accused of a crime. The Sixth Amendment, you have the right to a speedy trial. You have a right to a public trial, right? Trials are completely open to the public. Like you can walk down 161st Street or Center Street or whatever and walk in and watch, maybe not now because of COVID, but you have the right to go watch a trial. Because they're public, right? We don't have secret trials in the United States, right? That's what repressive societies do. Sometimes people are a little surprised I could just walk in and watch a case. Yes, you can, because that's the whole idea, that cases are tried publicly in our country. You have the right to cross-examine witnesses. If you're a defense, right, or defendant, or your counsel has the right to question the government's witnesses against you. You have the right to a lawyer. You have the right to counsel. If you are accused of a crime. The way that was interpreted pre-1964 was, well, you have the right to a lawyer, but that didn't necessarily, if you couldn't afford one, oh well. But after the Gideon versus Wainwright decision in 1964, the court said that, well, if you can't afford a lawyer, one has to be appointed for you. So it's not like you just have a theoretical right to a lawyer. You have the right to have an actual lawyer. Whether you can afford one or not. Remember, the vast majority of criminal defendants cannot afford lawyers. So that's a very important right. The Seventh Amendment says you have a right to a jury in a lawsuit and in all civil cases. Remember, criminal cases involve potentially being sent to jail. Civil cases involve money, right? So you have the right to a jury trial in a civil case. The Eighth Amendment bans cruel and unusual punishments, which again is vague, right? Because what does that mean, right? That's kind of in the eye of the beholder. Some people would argue the death penalty in and of itself is cruel and unusual punishment, while others argue it's not. So that's open for debate. As are a lot of these amendments, right? There's a lot of gray area. So different people interpret these amendments very differently. Excessive bail or excessive fines cannot be charged to you. That's another right that you have in the Eighth Amendment. The Ninth Amendment says that just because some rights are listed doesn't mean other rights are denied to you. That, remember, was Madison wrote that because that was his original objection to having a Bill of Rights, that including some rights would mean that, well, unless they're included, you don't have them. So that's what the Ninth Amendment says. Just because the rights aren't listed here doesn't mean you don't have those rights. And the 10th Amendment, the one conservatives to this day love, it says powers not given to the federal government have to be given to the states and to the people. So that's a very brief summary of the amendments, of the first 10 amendments of the Constitution. Those are the Bill of Rights that were drafted and ultimately ratified in response to anti-federalist objections to the Constitution. And these are our basic protections as Americans. These are our civil liberties. Very, very important. It protects political opposition, right? If you're opposed to the government, you can speak out against the government. You can publish things against the government. You can protest against the government, right? This is very, very important. And one of the things that we cherish as Americans, right, having these protections. But also, if you're accused of a crime, that you have basic protections, right? That you can't just be arbitrarily arrested or detained. Just think about how much of the Constitution deals with matters of criminal justice, right? That if you're accused of a crime, you have to be guaranteed certain rights and protections. So, you know, that's why I really think the whole debate over criminal justice reform today is not only very important on the merits, but it's also something that's historically well grounded, because the people who wrote the Constitution were very mindful of the rights that you have in case you're charged with a crime. So this is another long running discourse in American history, like all the way to the current day. What rights do you have if you're accused of a crime? The Constitution created a representative republic, not a direct democracy. Because the thing is, we elect people to represent us, and then once we elect them, then they're allowed to vote as they see fit on whatever issues, right? We don't have a direct democracy. We are a republic. And that's very important to remember. People elect their representatives, who would then make the decisions on how to run the government. All right, guys, very good. So we'll stop now. Remember, always watch these videos from start to finish. I'll leave you on Google Classroom a copy of the Bill of Rights for all of you to read and enjoy. And also I'll leave you Federalist number 10, because I want you guys to read that as well. And I will see you all in class on Thursday. And I think later in the week I actually have a really good article I want you guys to read about constitutional changes that were wrought by Donald Trump. And his conduct over the course of his presidency. It was a great article. A friend of mine from school, my last school, well, that was many years ago, but like, he was still in touch, and he sent me this article, and it was very, very good. And I'd like you guys to, I think I might leave that for you on Friday if you're asynchronous assignment. All right, so I will see you all on Thursday. Peace.